Good afternoon to all of you. Welcome. It's 12 o'clock and it's time for Jeremy Vearey and the launch of a very exciting memoir, an unusual memoir. I've called it a rare avis of a memoir. Pleased to get it. It's called Into Dark Water. Jeremy, welcome. Thank you very much for being available for this launch. I'm really excited by it. I think many people here know you as the cop in uniform with the cap on and in the headlines a lot of the time for different reasons. But to me, what's important about this webinar is that it's about your book and it's about writing, and it's unusual for us to have a police chief who is as skilled in writing and as literary as you are, who's as interested in history, philosophy, and everything else. So let us just begin a little bit with, often people write memoirs at the end of their careers and their lives, So what's the positioning of this? And it's called the police memoir, so it's not supposed to be a personal memoir. What is the decision for you to do this book now? And talk to us a bit about the writing and the challenges of writing it, because there's a lot that you could have said.
Okay, I think it comes from my approach and need to write this book. Comes partly from the tumultuous experiences inside the organization that I've been in the headlines for the past 25 years, related to contradictions within the police between the old and the new, and the not so new is emerging, and various interest groups in the police and criminal syndicates in the police who act in it. So there was a need to use my experience in the police to highlight these dimensions, not only the shadows in the organization, but also the shadows within myself, and what that interaction brought about to where I am now. But that's the one part in general. The other part is a particular approach that my mentor and first cause in writing gave me. It's a writer called Anne Schuster. I used to attend her classes for 6 months in the Grail. Every Sunday and weekend I used to go up. And she saw life writing differently than just writing biographies or memoir. But as an exercise where you gather parts of your lost selves together, you remember the past, and you reconstruct what might become a new self, or the basis for a new self. So I approached Into Dark Water, like with my previous book, to go look at those experiences that I could reflect on, that would contribute to that reconstruction of this new self, or gathering together parts of a self to form the basis for building or reconstructing a new one. So out of that, lessons from Anne, it has a lesson in writing, in approach towards memoir, that is not your classical one, okay? As in Anne's memoir, called Foolish Decisions, she calls it a novel's auto/biography. And she doesn't write it in the classical format. She draws very on the human drive factors that drive things, instead of looking at the world as only external factors shaping you and driving you and blaming them and all those kind of things, externalizing everything. She looks for the balance in an experience that both produced her and reproduced her, and both produced her and how she reproduced herself in that experience. So my approach to the whole books was to find those experiences, bad or good, whatever they were. I'm not judgmental about them. That speaks to the shadows that also shaped me, and the shadows present in the system or in society out there that I interacted with to shape me. So the dark side was quite a good thing to come to the lighter side at the end. That's the way I see the journey, dialectically, rather than just a series of progressive steps. of all the good things towards the end. Yeah. So that is what inspired me more or less. But it's more Anne's approach to life writing, and how she systematically took me through how to write emotion, how to bear yourself, but still remain and gain agency over your own past and agency over your own experiences. There's some things that you would like to forget, but that you shouldn't forget. And writing about it requires an emotional engagement, a selection of words that speak to that emotional engagement that you must put on paper. That's it, basically.
Well, you speak now about words, and you and I, for different reasons, both have an affinity for Afrikaans.
Oh, yeah.
It's your kom vandaan, it's your moedertaal, it's your harttaal, but you speak English as well. Was the process of writing Jeremy from the Elsies, which you won a prestigious Rapport Kyk Prize for, which is a big deal, especially coming from a policeman as well, writing this different memoir. Was it the Afrikaans? Because also, if people are not speaking Afrikaans and watching this, I have to tell you that what Jeremy's done with Afrikaans is made it literary. In the most extraordinary way. It has been done before by other writers, but this one as a memoir. Speak to me about, are you different when you speak Afrikaans and when you write English, or when you write Afrikaans? Because the words and language matter very much to you.
Okay. To tell you the truth, I actually think in Afrikaans before I write it in English. Okay. And I try to capture with word selection, idiomatic usage. In English, I try to mirror the Afrikaans or Afrikaans at some point. I attempt my best to it in the way I would tell a story. And that would essentially be the way I would use it. But I always think in Afrikaans or Afrikaans. Afrikaans, fascinating is that the first book was part of the course that I went through with Anne. So, and Anne, although she comes from the Free State, she was entirely English speaking. Okay, the way I understood her. Anna Maria, apart net Afrikaans, but she was very, very English speaking. And but despite being that, she assisted me chapter by chapter. Halfway into the book, she passed on, but with the kind of emotional tools in writing that I needed to tell the story the way I did. In Africa, she insisted that I speak my birth language and not what I learned scholastically at school in Afrikaans or in English, that I write it as it is and try and shape it. And that was quite difficult at one point, but she took me through that exercise. So I now can even conceptualize, I can abstract in Afrikaans. It has always been, there is an ability to abstract in Afrikaans. There is ability to write intellectually in Afrikaans. But through the way standardized Afrikaans or scholastic Afrikaans has sort of repressed that type of need. We always looked on that as our Kaaps as something we speak at home or in the street. This book of Jeremy van die Elsies helped me to reconstruct the role of Afrikaans in that context. Yeah,
that's very important because, as you say as well, Afrikaans, as we were taught it, is called algemeen beskaafd, which means generally civilized, which in a sense then suggested that anyone who spoke anything outside of that was uncivilized. So what's beautiful about that is that you make that your own. But that is a book about you. This is a book it's a police memoir. You must have had a few reservations because, I mean, you've seen a lot in the SAPS. And how do you keep the book focused? As you said earlier on, I can see how it's because you keep it on yourself and the shadows and the dark stream here is where you've gone. But what were the challenges around telling the story without, in a sense, being sued or being pursued or being, as you have been, by people within SAPS itself over the years? Because people often run to a memoir to find out if they're in it, first of all, and if they're not, they're disappointed, and sometimes if they are, they sue you. So just your approach to that problem of a memoir that is about a very fraught organization.
Okay, the story came first and not what would happen to me. If, for example, in a chapter on a meeting, I particularly deal with a meeting called the PCCF, Provincial Crime Combating Forum, sometime in the 90s, under the chairpersonship of General Petros. And what happened there. Now, instead of being judgmental, for example, and just making a bland statement, this was a bully and this was all of those things, I described the mood of the meeting, how people were conducting themselves, and you can draw your own conclusion from it. So one of the things I try to steer clear of is judgmental statements about people. Okay. But explaining actions of people situationally. Okay, one. And not only through the experience of my own lens, but through what other people tell me about what they are experiencing. And try and do that as accurately as possible so that there's a wider kind of point of view than just what I saw. So that is one of the ways, but I did not hold back on things. That way of writing, although it's more elusive, I should say that, suggestive in the way it writes. From a literary perspective, sometimes says a hell of a lot more deeper about both the writer, a lot more things deeper, and what is there. Because you can feel what is there. Broad, bland statements, you look at it, and you move on, But you need to feel what happened there, feel the experience thing, and that's how I get around that. So
it's a brilliant.
People can't. I mean, I don't know how people are going to be suing me for the way I felt back in 1999.
Yeah. You never know.
But I write with the way I felt in 1999, and even in my earlier chapters in that book, I try to put myself in the position of the way I felt and thought at the time, so that I don't let hindsight of now interfere and paint myself an angel or something like that with hindsight. So those are the ways in which people are going to have a tough time arguing against the way I felt.
Well, I think that's also what you've said yourself. That's the key to the depth of the text.
Yeah.
Is that it's not just a recounting of a series of events. When you talk about feeling, I now want to sort of move to some of the cases that, as a policeman. And I think what people will read in the book, and I do advise people, we won't be able to talk in an hour about everything that is in this remarkable book, but your approach to policing also very different. But, you see things as a policeman and as a cop and a detective that in a sense require one to stop feeling in a way. It is just so overwhelming, the kind of brutality of the murder of children and other people. But there are memorable cases you write about. Also, I must just tell everybody that Jeremy's sense of humor is so subtle that there are many instances in the book where you will laugh out loud when you don't expect it. Suddenly you're on a plane with him to Germany for training, and a simple interaction with the air hostess and the way you've written it exposes beautifully your own state of mind and her nonchalance and the fact that we assume things a lot of the time. And you send yourself up there. But tell me a bit about the cases for you that shaped and how you held on to feeling. What was it? Was it an ideology behind it? Was it a commitment? Because many people in this job stop feeling they can't do it anymore. And Jack Daniels helped.
Jack Daniels definitely helped, I must say. Yeah. Jack Daniels helped substantively at some point in time until he became a problem. I had to kill him off. But one of the I just want to illustrate with the example of the serial rapist case, the naval guy that we caught, the Litsonia Jack.
Yes, incredible story.
You know, the engagement with those women victims, survivors, let me not call them victims. I think it was one of the most harrowing experiences I had. It was not so much the docket and going to a crime scene, but it was just their personal engagement with them. To sit, for example, with one case, I referred to where a statement was taken in isiXhosa, but the woman was actually Tswana, and we retook the statement. We were able to narrow down the suspect when he spoke. That woman was a grandmother of 70, and that rape occurred in front of her grandchildren. Now, to hear somebody tell you that story, and now having to go all over again because you want the statement taken down in her language again. I mean, I thought about it a long way time before I sent the detectives to do that, but I rather went with. And when it was done, you know, that experience, I could feel this woman's pain, you know. And so with all the other victims, with the survivors, sorry, let me go back to that, with the survivors, for example, who said, look, their lives have moved on, they are married, or Lawani became a senior officer in the Navy, and said, look, she doesn't need that noise in her life at this moment. So, I mean, it's just that exercise was to me the issue. But I think that is at the level of the human engagement with survivors of rape victims. It's quite traumatizing, I think, personally for me too. The other thing, I think, crime scenes, I mean, I've been in many murder scenes. I've seen gangsters shot. I mean, it's not the gruesomeness of the scene that is the issue. But I highlight a particular case of Roseanne, a girl that was taken into the mountains out at Harrowing kept because her sister had a problem with her husband, who's a drug dealer and abalone smuggler, and needed the money, because all the property was on her name. And they basically used this girl as a way to threaten the sister and eventually killed her. I mean, a young girl in school uniform, taken out and seeing burnt, literally, being kept for days and those things. It's where it's the starkness of seeing something like that in the beautiful mountains of Harrowing. You know, there are some things that you take a combination of that beauty with pieces of a young girl's uniform burnt all over the place. It's not what you usually see on the Cape Flats. The Cape Flats, you go there to the crime scene and overpark. There's a guy shot with 10 times through his head or whatever that happens. It's a normal routine scene. Yeah, the combination of a 14-year-old girl in a beautiful setting being murdered in the way she does. Not that a murder was an issue, and me seeing bones with bits of clothes and that. It's the starkness of those things that hit you. Another case I describe is the serial rapist in Hermanus, in Hemel op Aarde Vallei. And the moment when he kept his own daughter, he kidnapped when she was 2 years old, and a 14-year-old girl he kidnapped and kept in a dugout underground for 2 years. And the moment they came out, I was trying to speak as softly as possible, and this little girl, his daughter, says, "Meneer moet asseblief nie so hard praat, jy praat sagter." And then you realize, and that affected me quite heavily, because then it brings home what they suffered, because they were not allowed to speak loud because they were in a dugout. He would go out and rape other women in the surrounding farms, stay away, and they literally would not escape out of that particular hole, although it was easy to do so. But the fact that they were for 2 years told to be silent, you know, was to me besides what happened to them, I think, much more grueling in the way I experienced it and the way it affected me. So, yeah, that is what affects, the multiple crime scenes and going to this one being shot and that one in the usual setting, if one should put it like that, of the Cape Flats. That was not so much. It's these outlier experiences. The cases involving children, the cases involving women, that affected me, and the callousness of some of the perpetrators. Okay, like Lotsoño, the serial rapist. I mean, the fact that a man keeps a diary in military notation, punished sexually on 2,100 hours, 30 at what. I mean, it affected me. The other thing of the Lotsoño case is the failure of the system. He, when he was a naval cadet, left Bultfontein in a cloud. He raped a young girl as she was coming through the reeds. He reconstructs all of this in his consequent rapes. She was coming through the reeds from church. But because he was now a naval prospective cadet, the uncle of the girl, who was a police officer, together with the community, they decided, no, it's at the farm, this thing should be dealt with otherwise, and should not go to the law, and they should not take it further. And that put him on the course that he is, partly because one of the things is he reconstructed that scenes when he rapes women in fields on their way from work, nurses, or especially women who have a profession and those kind of things. He loved that. He even chose sex workers, for that matter, when he was in various military posts, and he did that, and naval women in the Navy. So the thing about Lotsoño is that the system failed in that way, that if a police officer had done what he was supposed to, he could have picked up the psychological problems that came with that. His own story is another horrendous story about what happened to his mother, which is partly contributed to the fantasy he was trying to recreate. But if somebody had just picked this up, if somebody had just taken that further, we would not have sat with a Lotsoño who raped at least 35 women in the Western Cape and several others in Saldanha when he was at a military base, and some when he was at cadet school in Pretoria. We would not have sat with that.
Yeah.
And
but Jeremy, this approach that you have in terms of thinking deeply about whatever is what you brought then to your policing.
Yeah.
I think so. It's very evident in the book as well that first of all, I mean, you're from Elsie's River. That's what your book is about. Yeah. You grew up there. I love the way you start your book, which is, I've always preferred knives to guns. Like a macho. You were laughing earlier because you said you are one of only two men to go through Anne's writing course. She didn't take men on. Only two. Because you're a bit like a macho there, but you get the sense of it. So your approach to policing then not only comes from having grown up there and having dealt with that stuff, but then also from having been in Umkhonto weSizwe, having been underground, and tell us what happens when you begin to where you become a leader in certain areas and your approach to policing, and how that is so different from what people mostly experience and the successes of that, because I think it can be done differently. This people-centered policing, when you have a leader like yourself who knows the community and knows the gangsters, what were the pitfalls around trying it? Was it easy to motivate people to become more community, or SAPS to become more community-centered?
I think mine was more because I had the authority of being a station commander in the LCs, and which was plain. I just instructed people to change their approach. So what I did is they used to have these shift commanders, 2 captains on a shift, which I thought was a waste of time. One sits in the office and the other one sits outside. And I took out of a pool of captains and I said, look, we are not going to send constables to be sector commanders. You are going to become that. And I explained to them what it means is that in terms of the Police Act now, we need to problem solve issues as far as possible together with the community. The Act actually prescribes that. Now, what does that mean practically? You have to engage the community more. If they're not organized, you must see that there are organized structures at local level in order to facilitate that engagement. So first go and do two things before you go around building your own structures. Go look at what is the community doing to address crime. If a few aunties are walking down the street every morning with children to ensure that they go safely to school, that is where you should also be. The van in proximity, so that the action by the community is reinforced by your presence, because you can't be everywhere at the same time. And you also demonstrate to the community, if you are organized as a collective together, street committee, whatever you want to call yourself, we will be there to reinforce with our part of the job. Okay, so that's part of it. And I think in terms of my past, that's where I saw my mother's work, my auntie's work like that way, although there was no policing presence. But I could see what their mere presence brought in a difference between being robbed, coming home from school, when they're not there and when they are there in the collective and what they are able to avert. So I saw practically what they could do. I think the other thing is practical things, I don't know if you know Zianda Sierman, who wrote a brilliant book, Can We Be Safe? On policing. It's been released, The Future of Policing in the SA. She's from Google Earth too. She describes a very practical experience that I remember from my days also, if you get a car or whatever, a bicycle eventually, let your dad ride around with a bicycle. And then all the gangsters and scollies know, hey, that guy's Grootman's a bicycle. And she's playing experience with her dad taking a new Polo and driving it all around Google Earth so that everybody can see this car belongs to this man. It might be strange, but it actually prevents that car or bicycle from being stolen. I've seen what Mitchell's Plain women do, where they close the drug dealer through simple interception of the children, and they have bonfires and braai outside and they invite evangelists to come and preach every day there. So they have a constant circle of community presence. Eventually, nobody goes to buy drugs anymore, and places closed. Now, I compare that with some cases in Mitchell's Plain where it took us 5 years to close a drug outlet and get the asset over transferred to, confiscate by the assets forfeit and send the chap to jail for 10 years in one particular case. We were able to achieve with what the community was doing through a consistent and sustained campaign by grassroots structures, parents policing their own children who buy drugs or their elders, in a short space of time, and adding our police presence to that when they do it on a Saturday night and Sunday night. So that is what I see as the model. You see, it's the approach I forward. You need organic community involvement from the ground. You need to have everybody focus on a particular, and not abstractions, we're going to prevent robberies or something. This place is in your neighborhood at that corner of the street. That is the problem. And we give you the information. That's what I did. I didn't worry about statistics and all of those things. I gave people in the street the information on the crime, where it happens and what, and who it seems is the problem here. It seems we might have a local, or it might be somebody coming over with Mitchell's Plain nights from Portlands to Westridge or Westridge to Tafelsig. We could explain those things. So that was the one part of it. But a lot of my work is the approach to the youth based on how I grew up. Now, I didn't get to become where, despite being a youth at risk at the time, I said I walked around with knives. I didn't rob people, but I considered me having a right to have a knife to stab the gangster who's trying to rob me. It's a cycle of violence. But what I understood is that was the only way, back when I was younger, in which you can stand up for yourself. What I learned in Mitchell's Plain and Elsie's River is that the generation of young people were beginning to emerge who can solve problems differently. You know? I mean, when I walk down the street when growing up in Elsie's River and 5 people are coming from the other side, I am not going to cross over to the other side. You know, that macho kind of thing. But today, that type of behavior of crossing over and preventing the conflict would be normal. It wouldn't actually be considered wiser. Finding a different solution to dealing with an argument that we would order brought us to fisticuffs when I was growing up is part of standardly the way people are engaging in some parts of the Cape Flats. And I find that promising and encourage those kind of initiatives when I was involved in with the sector commanders in working on schools, in spotting conflict between people who can potentially result in a gang conflict after they go from school, and trying to find places to resolve it with us. Bringing the different stakeholders who could make that possible. But with us being present there, not as a threat, but as a problem solver, as the Police Act requires us to do that. And at schools with youth, you know, I saw Mitchell's Plain as a township which has the most schools. It has, I think, 112 schools, of which 17 or 18 are high schools. I mean, it's a gold mine for gang recruitment. Okay. But it's a gold mine only at those schools where people are not involved in activity that gives them an alternative sense of peerage or belonging. So one of the things we did is to go out there and look at if it's unsafe to play rugby or soccer or netball and nobody's interested, we would see that our sector commanders are actually active at the schools where I even had sports officers, for example, for different schools. We assigned them. They would be active there so that their presence can encourage more participation if the safety is a problem. But the other part was that they could also use that opportunity to identify problems that might require problem solving through that particular engagement. But one thing I found particularly important, I write about it in the book, is a project we had called, it might sound military, the marching drill competitions, which later became a national thing. And I found it very surprising that initially they just gave us kids before they expelled. And I told them, we don't want these kids to end up in the gangs. So let's try a last chance. We're going to try an option. I'll give this person assigned to the school. Give us the 10 most problematic people and we'll work with it. And we started from there. And we asked people, what should we do? And people thought, maybe this cadet drill kind of thing, one of the kids. So we said, okay, let's try that. And then it grew into what it was. Okay. But
tell people what it is today. Today, the marching bands.
Okay. Today it is marching bands. There are street committee band marching. There's everything. It's a revival of the old drumline type of activity you see on TV. But it speaks on it goes back to a tradition on the Cape Flats where you had these church bands that used to walk through the street and blow brass and play drums and all those kind of things. And organizations in the 70s, like that one organization of the True Templars, we used to have similar exercises in the thing. And so there was something that could bring older people together with young people, and we got the community involved in that activity quite. Today, I think the competition is national. Everybody comes to Mitchell's Plain from PE, where the government supports it in PE, the provincial government. They sponsor everything. And in not Port Elizabeth or Eastern Cape. And from as far Northern Cape, those schools come together to Mitchell's Plain for the annual event. But it's an activity that goes. And what happened in 2 years after we started this in 2007, suddenly people said, but why are you doing this only for the naughty kids? Can't you do it for us also? And that's how it became a broader activity that it has now. And girl children lead now. You go look at any group. It's bizarre. This time, the drummers have been relegated to boys playing the drums, walking down. But the whole, from the person who leads to the front line, to the people who do certain selective type of pace, paces they go through, and those things are led by girl children. And that to me is quite fast. And it has become an activity. COVID stopped it for a while, but it's an activity that involved an annual event on the cultural calendar of Mitchell's Plain.
Yeah, which is
fantastic. So that is it. But it was about starting off creating alternative forms of peerage and belonging to that gangs offer.
Okay, so let's talk to them about the gangs, because I mean, they're going to notice you're around. I mean, and we know that the gang problem in the Western Cape has a long history, and many people talk about it on Pinnock and various others. Yourself and kind of realizing, how does one act or decide who to take down and when? Because tentacles are everywhere. That's one of the stories I wanted you to talk about. And then I wanted you to talk about, for me, one of the most significant breakthroughs that you and your team accomplished, which was the arrest of lethal gang war in Mitchell's Plain, and how that case was solved by yourself, and Peter Jacobs was part of it, Ontong was part of it, good detectives. People must know also, I just want to tell people watching that while SAPS leadership might be in the news a lot, through my work that I do, I've met exceptional people in SAPS, absolutely exceptional South Africans. Jeremy is one of them, and there are many others. But tell us a bit about those two issues, right? Sort of you must have sort of come into the sights of the gangs because you're a threat to them. And
let's
then
talk about gangs. I think there was for all these years a misunderstanding of what gangs are from the business side. They are criminal enterprises. I mean, if the hard livings can exist for 50 years, then there must be something that sustains it. And that's not only macho bravado and the other parts. It's money that sustains it. It's business activity, extortion, drug dealing in drugs, arms trafficking. It's all those things that sustain it. Big heists and those things. So it is an enterprise. It's like a company. It is one of those longest surviving companies compared to most company histories I know. They don't go through depression and all those kind of those areas. But when deciding to target and what to target in them, there's three things I look at. I look at what business activity, because you can't tackle them all at the same, generates the most income. The second thing I look at is what activity in the criminal enterprise, if we target them, will net me the most leadership aspects. And they are not complicated cases sometimes. Rashid Staghi, we caught on a rape. So that is what we look at, what sustains the largest driver of the profit that they make, and that can net us the largest amount. And if we remove them, the other part that comes as a bonus is what would paralyze the gang for a reasonable time. Okay? Because they will reemerge in different forms and become wiser as a result of the way they were tackled before and improve their methodology. So that is what it is. So it's a never-ending struggle of looking at what you see and having the information that analyzes climate measures, the gang's activity in terms of its nature, scale, and extent, and looking for those weak points where you can maximize your impact and disrupt them, at least for a short while, in terms of what would sustain them. But that is how I think. But then you need constant capacity to do that, because these things have been around for 200 years, numbers games in particular. So that is what the approach I particularly follow. For example, there might be 100 murders in Menenberg in last year. It is the 10 murders that nets us the best suspects. and brings us closer to the enterprise activity as per motive that we will take and we will build our cases around. So that is essentially the approach that is followed. And I particularly look for what I'm saying, the drivers of violence in individuals, What one studies, and you can see this one is coming up, they're offering a 14-year-old a gun. 10 years from now, I'm going to sit with a major hitman across the country. So where do we intervene against who, where? But all of this requires crime intelligence to have its act in order. And if you don't have the type of information that can climate measure, see the nature of how the threat changes and what your impact is if you do something and take some out of circulation, then you're wasting your time. So what has happened in my approach, where there were those deficits in crime intelligence, I let the detectives do the crime intelligence work themselves, which caused a lot of problems. But General Jacobs always says, with Vearey, if he's asking you for something once, he's probably knowing you're not going to give it, and then he's going to do it himself next week. So that's the approach that one does follow in terms of gangs in particular. Yeah. The other part of your question, if you could just repeat it, there was a section where you broke up a bit.
Oh, okay, sorry. What I meant to ask was, I think one of the biggest cases was the solving of the selling of guns, SAPS guns or guns
yes.
to the gangs. I mean, it actually, as you say, but I just wanted to add into that people viewing and watching can ask questions just now if you want to, but just that you yourself become a target of police inside service instances when you are somebody who's successful. For people not to forget that you're facing those pressures. But tell us about Gang's case. It's so significant, and what does it say about SAPS and where it is now?
I think one of the things that case has taught me is not to ignore a single bit of information. When Sergeant X Thamm, who is the start of all of those things, came to me and told me that his informants are telling him that they can buy Z88s at a case of 14, 15 at a time. Initially I had to put aside what I might think based on the limited information I have, thinking that I know the big picture at that point in time, and just listen to him and said, okay, let's run with this. Let's test this. That's where we brought in General Jacobs and we made a few buys, which are all part of the open record now. So I'm not in secrets. We made a few tests, but we actually proved that they were dealing with these weapons and that they were police weapons. But from there, the investigation went wider and we discovered military weapons. And we discovered even civilian firearms and heritage weapons, they were all altered in a particular way that requires highly specialized knowledge that we have in the police. So, you understand? And they showed the same signature. And that was picked up ballistically after we got our 14 guns that we bought and all those kind of things. And we now were able to drive this. And from then on, for 2 years, it was trying to work amongst the Harrowing office. Who exactly is responsible for this? Because the scale at which it was happening, not only in the Cape Flats, it was going to KZN, into the taxi and political conflict. It was going to the taxi conflict between Bata and Vearey in the Eastern Cape. It was landing up in gangs in the Eastern Cape. The scale was simply too big, and it meant either one of two things. Either there were generals who did not do their work, who claim in inspection reports that even provincial commissioners that everything is okay at Silverton Store, because they're only looking at what is presented to them administratively. Or they were corrupt themselves, benefiting from it. The result was we had to monitor all of them. And that is another thing which made them unhappy. Everything from, and even my closest friend and comrade, Gary Cruiser, was very angry when this happened because we walked into his store and we just took over. And he was supply chain. So we monitored everybody, whether it's the National Commissioner, because we simply could not understand the type of negligence that would go into it and whether there was criminal liability. So the monitoring of everybody in order to shift between who's responsible was that. But in terms of the act of doing it, the people who were busy with it, we then narrowed it down to Silverton. And what helped us is we were able to track multiple sources of weapons. So a military-based Durban light infantry in Durban who sends guns through that disappears. So we had that information. Guns, civilians enter, guns, heritage firearms from an old Tanny with one was particularly significant. I think it's about 15 million pounds, this gun. It's an old antique dual pistol Spurdy, and it's in a rosewood case from sometime in the 1700 hours that landed up in the Eastern Cape. But anyway, and we were able to then track all of this. So we were able to determine the key parameters of this investigation. One is there's a demand for heritage arms. So some private collectors who want particularly British weapons out of the last war they technically spared, certain regiments spared from that, the Transvaal Regiment or the Durban Light Infantry Regiment we're using, were actually disappearing. And then we started picking up Bren guns and a new light machine gun called the SS-77 developed in South Africa 2 years before that was beginning to be in experimental stage that was flight. So we saw now there's a military need for this. Where are these guns going? And we ended up tracing a pipeline out of the country to conflict areas in terms of that. We then identified the security industry who had a rapid need. If they apply for a tender for an armed contract, for example, they have to have proof they have guns. So if you have corruptly know you're going to get the tender in October, however the paperwork must show that you can get guns, you need to get the 50 guns for the 50 guards very, very fast. So the licensing process got corrupted also. Because guns needed to be delivered fast. And one company I know we got onto, they didn't even exist. They had an address, a non-existent street address, but they had 55 guns on their name, and they disappeared. So we then saw this big morass that became not only the Silverton stores, but also what was happening at the CFR, Central Firearm Registry. And I want to do a particular thing to tell you the depth of it. When we went to arrest people at the CFR and moved in there, almost everybody ran out of the building. They left their desks and everybody went. And we went there, not politely, we went there with a warrant, like we're going to a drug outlet. You know, and everybody just jumped and left their desks, just like which enabled us to have easier access to everything. But one of the things that we discovered, for example, we did a raid where we confiscated mortar launchers and some light machine guns and hand grenades from a gun shop in Brackenhurst in Joburg. Now, it was a massive amount of weapons, so we were going to count these things to enter it into the evidence store for days. Around about, in the counting process, about 5 o'clock the next morning, we picked up these weapons were being changed on the CFR computers to give it a legitimate status, which means somebody hacked the system. And in order to hack the system, they might have had access to the passwords that coming from corrupt members there. And that is what we saw there, you know. Parallel to that, just to say, the case I'm going to be testifying into of Ralph Stanfield and about 21 others. You start in October. I'm going to testify there on the racketeering matters later. That case was a similar licensing thing. And what is particularly problematic, we've got 2 police officers arrested from the CFR in there. What is particularly significant in that case is that all the licenses that are given to the gangsters there are sports licenses, which means there's no limit on ammunition purchased. As opposed to you with your little 38 special, and it gets written down. What did you do with the other box and that? All the sports license allow for more ammunition. And when we tracked,
is that a flaw? Is that a flaw in the law, or
well, but that was corrupt. That's a flaw in the law because the different, not even if you have the sports license, do the shops speak to the same database. So we're going to track whether you bought 10,000 rounds at this gun shop and another 20 there. Yeah, so those are the things. But what we saw parallel with these licenses coming out in bulk to gangsters all over the country is that on crime scenes here on the Cape Flats, we suddenly saw gangsters shooting with gay abandon at changing magazines and multiple. We never had that before this type of licensing and this Prinsloo situation. Before that, a gun was a sacred thing in the stash. No, not everyone didn't have it in the gang. It gets taken out of the stash when you get it. Now people are walking around with this stuff. They're being issued stuff. The amount of ammo they're sitting with is sourced from the gang leaders who have sports licenses. So those are the kind of things, the implication of those cases. And once again, it's state failure. The conditions that bred this proliferation of violence, despite gangs existing for a long time, was caused by the South African Police Service. We put the guns out there. There's no single arms dealer that we found that has supplied so much in bulk to the gangs than Prinsloo.
You got 20 years for that.
Yeah.
Yes. Which is important for people to remember. We've only got a few minutes left, and we haven't even gone to where I wanted to. You touched on it slightly here now, but literally we've got a few minutes left, and there's one question that I'm going to end off with. But the security industry itself, as we know, is a systemic problem in South Africa. And if you look at what you're saying now, but that's for a conversation for another time, and a very serious conversation for another time. Gregory Denason has asked a question, and I think there are a few others. I'm going to try and get to them. We've got that's one of the biggest questions, and I think you can maybe answer that. In the force, you see the dirty, dark, ugly side of life all the time. How did you retain a perspective to be creative and actually so above it all in a certain sense? Although people will see when they read the book, you were not above it all. For a long time it was.
No.
And you were it. So it inhabited you in a way. But maybe we've got time for you to just maybe end off on that. And somebody else is writing, Jan Vearey says, Moerala Jeremy. But anyway, you can answer Gregory's question. Ugly side, how do you keep perspective?
I think for one part, I was quite an ascetic, me and Mr. Jack Daniels. It was between two of us and the rest of the world was out there. It did not help me deal with my internal shadows, but the sense of totally isolating yourself from what is life out there in order to devote entirely to your job, getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning, finding the excitement of a crime scene more exciting than going out with your son, that kind of thing. There was just, that is what did it. But after I killed Jack Daniels, I think what sustained me is the reconstruction of my life with my family, the bringing of that balance, and solving my insomnia problem, though it still creeps in when I have to write books. I continue, but
at least you can read, Jeremy. If you don't sleep, you can just pick up, because your range.
I read.
Your range of reading is non-stop. So good.
I read. So I filled the space. Books have taken the space of Jack Daniels. The time that I would go sit in a pub out at Imatu up the road, and spend some time with some interesting characters I describe in the book. That's quite a few hours.
Wonderful descriptions.
Few hours I can now spend. I take every time to read. I go somewhere when I have space, I read. and that's part of the balance and writing now. Like I said, like Anne says, Schuster, you're reconstructing and gathering parts of yourself when you write. And
Jeremy,
and that is helping me a lot. Yeah.
Having reconstructed yourself and gathered yourself back and found a freedom in a way away from a world out there you've been immersed in. We haven't even talked about your political which is also great.
No, but I'll be back.
Yeah. Well, that's good to hear because but you'll be back as a different Jeremy, I think, as a
Yeah, no, it's a different Jeremy.
Yeah. It's a different Jeremy. How deep is the trouble we are in? We've got a few more minutes. I mean, in terms of SAPS turning it around, we see what happened in KZN and Gauteng with this, alleged insurrection and the availability of guns and the seeming inability of SAPS to make any difference. Will we ever get back to what the intention was, which is what you want as a police officer, as a law enforcement officer, a people-centered service? Is that at all possible?
I think it can. We have all the right policy, the nice tourist legislation to make things work and policies inside. But it depends on what is now a middle layer leadership, to me, in my opinion, for whom the community policing ethos is quite strong, not something you theoretically have gone through the practice of working at the station and practice of working with communities. And those ideas must be captured, because there are many police officers who think the way I do think and think beyond the way I think. But they are not the voices that you hear. They are not the voices that go into police strategy. The voices that go into police strategy are rather academic voices and people who have not been operational or been in the support services environment of the police all their lives. Those are the voices that talk abstractly to strategy. Hence strategy can't have any practical implementation plan. But there are a lot of these voices that are emerging. And one of the roles I think we need in the police is professional associations, or even the unions for that matter, that can start organizing these voices as a collective. Because, I mean, many of them, I'm just using an example of some of us, we probably see the National Commissioner more on TV than we actually see them in the organization in terms of their practical input. And that is what is required. And the other thing is strengthen stations, strengthen detection, because one of the issues is, and whether we like it or not, detectives put people in jail. It's not other people in uniform. We, through the case docket, get you into jail, and the prisons are full of those people. But it cannot be in a policing that we have system that the people who give you a grotesque output on the end part of the criminal system are the least resourced, because you have a notion that, or outdated notion, that the mere presence of a uniform with a gun at your side looking dangerous is going to prevent crime in South Africa. It doesn't prevent crime. People operate around your presence. People are not even deterred, because you are constantly in an arms race with the gangs anyway, and they can beat your hands down in that in terms of what Principal gave them. But that needs to be changed internally. We need to look at how we resource our detection environment and see that they're properly resourced. We have good detectives. Where's the technology? You cannot. What happens in a system where we run out of crime kits, where we run out of rape kits, where we run out of basic things like to complete our forensic investigations. I mean, our chemical reagents. We depend on these things with support services.
And that can be fixed.
But if that is not in place, and the corruption there is not dealt with, we will forever sit with these lags in our ability to deliver the service we did as detectives.
Jeremy, we've got 7 minutes before our room expires, whatever that means.
Okay.
I just want everyone to see the book. Thank you very much for writing it. It's a very important book in South Africa, from a place that many of us live with as well. So Jeremy, thank you very much for today, for the book. Thank you, all of you. The book is available from our bookshop as well, for tuning in. There's much more to this book than we could have touched on today. Please go out and get it. And Jeremy, sterkte with everything. There are a lot of people behind you. So thank you, sir, for everything you do.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you to everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.